Please be seated. Once upon a time, there was a woman who happened upon this passage from Luke's Gospel, the parable about Dives, or the rich man, and Lazarus. And so she, meditating on it, asked Jesus, well, what was it like to be in Hades? What was it like to be in paradise? And so it was granted to her this wonderful vision. And first it was an angel of the Lord that took her and escorted her to the halls of Hades, where Dives, or the rich man, went. And she got to the doors of the hall. It was a large banquet hall, very much like Harry Potter, and Hogwarts, And outside the hall, all she could hear was this terrible sound of people in agony, moaning and groaning and utter despair. But then the doors of the hall were opened, and it was like a formal English banquet. Everyone was dressed to the nines, and everyone had to sit up straight, and proper manners were exercised. And on the tables were practically breaking from all of the beautiful foods that were available, the fine wine. And it was all just perfectly dressed and perfectly laid out, except for one thing. Everyone had to eat with these very large utensils, like 5 feet long. And since it was a proper banquet, they had to hold the utensils by the handle. They couldn't hold it up close. And so they would dip into the food, and get a big old scoop of rice dressing, and they would just about get it to their mouths. And because the utensils were so long and so bulky and unwieldy, the food would tip over onto the table, and they were in utter despair because everyone was starving in the presence of this bounty. And that was Hades. And then the second banquet hall, the angel of the Lord led her in this beautiful vision of prayer, and it was paradise. And she was outside the banquet hall, same banquet hall, but instead of sounds of despair, she heard sounds of joy, happiness, conversation. People were laughing and cutting up and telling jokes, and it was just a place of merriment and joy and love. And the doors were opened, and it was the same formal dining room and the same dress that was required of everyone who was in attendance, and the tables were loaded with the same amount of food and beautiful presentation and nice drinks, and everything was the same. And even the large utensils, the large spoons were the same. The only difference was the people would take the large spoon, dip it into the rice dressing, and then feed the person across from them. And so everybody had something to eat because they were sharing the bounty one with another. And nobody went hungry. What a wonderful vision that must have been. And so as parables go, this parable that we have just heard proclaimed in Luke's Gospel, and it's only in Luke's Gospel, has to be one of the least familiar, and it flows from a previous dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees about the love of money and the search for riches. And what is true richness? What are true riches in our lives? And this parable is really not difficult to understand. It's a moral parable, a parable with a moral involved. But maybe it's a parable that's difficult for us to hear, because we have all encountered the Lazarus of the world. Now, maybe one of the reasons why this parable is difficult to hear is because we can't really identify with either character. You know, there's no one here that dresses in purple and fine linens. There's no one here that doesn't have to go to work every day or didn't until you retire. There's no one here that has people wait hand and foot on them. There's no one here that has these sumptuous feasts, and so much so that scraps fall from the table and the dogs come and eat what's left over. And there's no one here that's destitute. Lazarus is not poor. Lazarus is destitute. There's a difference. We all perhaps have experienced poverty. We may have experienced people who are homeless. We have experienced people who frequent our food pantry. But have we experienced destitution? And so it might be hard for us to identify Lazarus because we have not had that level of experience, destitution. But the point is not to establish guilt in our lives. We know that the least effective forms of motivating us are anger, fear, and guilt. And Jesus doesn't tell this parable to lay on us a guilt trip. Jesus doesn't tell this parable to make us fear for our eternal destiny. No, the point of the parable is different. That the rich man, he was not the cause of Lazarus' situation. The rich man is not necessarily bad. The rich man is not necessarily unkind to Lazarus. The point of the parable, the reason why he was condemned to Hades is because he was indifferent to the plight of Lazarus. He never even noticed the presence of the destitute Lazarus at his gate. The point of the parable is to remind us that we are all in this together, that this great cause we call life is all-inclusive, that we are all wrapped up in this great web of life. And no one is insignificant. No one is beyond help. That, in a sense, we could say that we all are kind of like Lazarus. We all are poor. We all are in need of help. It's a great principle of the spiritual life that salvation is beyond us, that no one can save himself or herself, and that salvation always comes outside of us. And so we're all poor, in need of salvation. We all are in need of being saved. And that maybe our wounds are kind of hidden. You know, that maybe our wounds are more psychological, more emotional, but we all have wounds. We all have been wounded by life. We cannot live the human life without being wounded. And so it's what do we do with our pain? I'll never forget Jim Basic. He was a campus minister at the University of Toledo. He used to always say, well, if you haven't encountered suffering in life. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer. And if you haven't encountered suffering in your life, you just haven't lived long enough, because it's coming, So, but our wounds are different. But we all are in need of God reaching out and saving us from outside of ourselves, saving us from ourselves. And another point that is really important for us to understand is that the world is not completely cold and heartless as this parable would make us believe. A Christian vision of responsibility and love has taken root in our world, that for over 2,000 years, the Christian message has been proclaimed from sea to shining sea, and people's lives have been transformed by the gospel. And so we have in our country, we have all of these safety nets, we have these social institutions, many of which have their roots in a Christian vision of reality. And so that is the Christian legacy that has been handed down from one generation to the other. And so here at St. Michael's, we have this wonderful legacy that has been handed to us. We tithe as a community of faith. 20% of everything that comes in goes to very beneficial and needy causes. We have a food pantry that we minister to on a regular basis to those who are in need of food. We have the Operation Christmas Child, that we contribute to. We have this vision of who we are as members of the body of Christ that has been handed on to us. And this is part of who we are as disciples of the risen Christ. And so this vision that has been given to us, however, has to be renewed. It has to be renewed on a regular basis. This commitment must be continually be embraced again by each new generations of Christians. Of course, we are not heartless. Of course, we would not let someone starve outside our door. That goes without saying. But there are always new Lazarus who appear at our doorway. There are always new Lazarus that we become aware of, that previous generations may not have seen, but now we see them. And so we have to renew that commitment to this great vision of Christian caring and compassion. It's like St. Francis, on his deathbed, told his followers, the friars that had formed around his charism, he said to them, "I have done what God has given me to do. Now you must do what God gives you to do." And that's the question that each of us must ask. What is it that God has given me to do individually, and what is it that God has given us to do corporately as a people of faith, so that we realize the job is never done? And that is the message of the Eucharist. It's about the peace of Christ. And in a few moments, we'll share that peace, one among others. But we can only find it by being in communion with the brokenness of the world. Isn't that a great paradox? We can only find the peace of Christ by being in communion with the brokenness of the world. symbolized by the brokenness of Jesus. There's a great moment in the Eucharist. It's called the fraction rite, and we do it at the communion anthem, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. And pay special attention today, because always break the host at that point. And the bread broken reminds us of Christ's body broken for you and for me. And the wine poured into the chalice reminds us of Christ's blood that was spilled out of love for you and for me. It is the promise and reality of unity from what is broken, life from pain and suffering, when undertaken in love. And that gives us the courage to face again the hunger in our own lives and the hunger in the world and the need in the world and the need in ourselves for salvation. For Christ is the giver who gives us peace, which flows out of his own broken body. Jesus left his purse to Judas Iscariot, his body to Joseph of Arimathea, his mother to John, his clothes to the soldiers, his peace to the disciples, his supper to his followers, his self as an example of servanthood, his gospel to the world, his presence to God's people. On one side of the door, the rich man feasts. On the other side of the door, Lazarus starves. Who holds the key to open the door? The answer to that question begins with the truth that doors are locked from the inside. Doors are locked from the inside. And only you and only I hold the key to open that door to a broken world so that it might be healed by our efforts.